Now, that should bring us to a few issues that are discussed in the literature in a kind of, I should say, vague way. I mean by the literature, that is the Islamic finance and economic literature over the last 30 or 40 years by many writers. Many of the papers and books that have been published, whether internet or hard copies, contain some kind of loose ends on these three issues: the risk, the developmental issue, and the contribution to society. I think to complete my idea in this regard, I'd like to throw some light on these 3 points. The first one, risk in Islamic finance. Basically, of course, the risk and risk map in finance have also to undertake deep change. When we understand Islamic finance through these innovation, then we really need to be ready to accept some changes in our conceptuation of risk. At one time, I remember one of the great scholars, as a matter of fact, who died, rahimahullah, in one of the meetings, he said that, well, he wants to see Islamic banks hitting markets and challenging prices. If I use the Arabic term, تناطح الأسعار وتقارع الأسواق. Well, I think that statement was really too much exaggeration. I wouldn't like at all Islamic finance intermediary units to do that, because Islamic finance intermediary units take funds from depositors on the agency basis. They are partners with it. The Islamic bank or the Islamic financial unit is an agent of the Islamic of the depositors. They are partners with it. Being an agent, it is required, unless clearly exposed and clearly given in a transparent way, that we are using your funds in a highly risk ventures, unless that is disclosed to depositors and commercial banks. We know all of them do not have that kind of disclosure. So when we talk about Islamic commercial bank, definitely the bank must minimize risk, must reduce risk to a minimum. Any kind of risk that can be avoided, it must be avoided, because it is an agent that is required to protect the asset of the depositors, of their partners. So their risk management, although risk we know it in every aspect of life, risk management in Islamic financial intermediary units, especially I am focusing here on what is called as commercial units, commercial Islamic banks. These especially should manage risk in a very prudent way. One, risk is not an asset. You cannot trade risk. You cannot sell or buy risk. Risk is not an asset. Risk is a hateful thing. Usually we like to avoid as much as we can. Of course, there are levels we cannot avoid, because we live life anyway, and we walk on the street, and we are exposed to all kinds of risk by simply living. But again, can we, when we earn by owning, what kind of risk we can avoid and what kind of risk we cannot avoid, but we can probably reduce to a minimum? Here where we need to really distinguish. Property risk, that is ownership risk, that is the risk that whatever you own may evaporate. That definitely is a risk you have to bear. And that is the kind of risk that is always associated with the entitlement, because it's a facet of ownership. So if you aim at making profit, you should be exposed to the ownership risk. But price risk, can you avoid it? Yes. In Murabaha we avoid it, and that makes Murabaha one of the most beautiful transactions for commercial Islamic banking, because it avoids price risk. It also avoids liquidity risk. Commercial banks, we know, are always required to match cash inflow, liquidity management, cash inflow and cash outflow. And the Wakala principle requires Islamic banks, commercial Islamic banks, to minimize risk and reduce it to the most lower level. Property risk must be borne, but it can be mitigated through insurance and other means. So we can reduce it and either insured or minimized by reducing the time of ownership to a minimum, to 1 second, which is fine, as long as ownership is fulfilled. Market risk and liquidity risk, price risk I should say, and liquidity risk should be avoided and can be luckily avoided in the two tools that are used in commercial Islamic banking today. The Murabaha, this explains why Murabaha takes about 90% of Islamic banks. There are writings that feel insecure or feel unhappy with this. I in fact feel happy, very happy with Murabaha taking 90% of the financing asset of the Islamic banks, and I feel very happy with it, and in fact I wish it is 100%. Murabaha and Ijara Muntahiya Bitamlik, both of them, that is a lease that ends with ownership, and Murabaha because they are based on avoiding price risk and liquidity risk. And this is also an explanation of why Islamic banks, commercial Islamic banks, have always been avoiding sharing contracts on the asset side. They could not finance on sharing because of the high risk that is involved in there. Of course, high risk both in price and in liquidity, and because they need to distribute profit to their depositors on a periodical basis, and financing on musharaka does not allow them. Now, of course, we are talking about commercial Islamic banks. We can, at a different setting, we can talk about venture capital in Islam. We can talk about investment banks, Islamic investment bank, but these are different species, and they depend on full disclosure and full transparency in matters of the amount of risk that a depositor or an investor can bear, and definitely those vary from one to the other. Credit risk in Islamic commercial banks, of course, it's exactly like credit risk in conventional banks, even with a little bit minor differences, like you cannot charge interest for delinquency, and you cannot earn. This is a principle, a moral principle that is interesting. You cannot earn from the mistake of others. You can earn by owning an asset, but if the other person made a mistake intentionally or not intentionally, that does not justify you earning from that mistake. That's an important point, and it's an important principle in the morality that we should look for. This means that in Islamic commercial banks and in all Islamic banks, if the debtor fails to pay on time, that does not justify you earning from that mistake. You may charge that debtor a penalty, but that penalty does not represent an earning to you, because you want to deter that debtor and you want to penalize him also for that mistake, especially when there may be doubt it is an intentional mistake. But you cannot earn from that, and that is why we say whatever penalty you charge, you give it to charity, except, of course, of a very small, minor point, that is, you are entitled to any additional out-of-pocket cost that is caused by the default of the other party. So if you have an additional out-of-pocket cost, like hire a lawyer, like paying some cost for sending a warning letter, or etc., that you are entitled to this additional cost. So credit risk is about the same in both banks, except with these minor differences. The issue of development. Islamic finance, whether we finance consumers or we finance business, is always, by definition, by its nature, is developmental, because it sticks to the real market and it always gives the signal to producers that the commodities they produce are desired in the market, they should produce more. And because you cannot make an Islamic finance without creating value. So by definition, in Islamic finance, you are creating value because it goes through sale, lease, or sharing. I mean, sharing, of course, when it culminates into sale of goods or product or services. Now, the second point here, Islamic finance creates added value. We are incorporating, in fact, the finance producer within the production process by being an owner and a seller, an owner and a provider of goods and services. So it is not, it is within the, as one of the links of the chain of wealth production. So it is, by definition, it adds wealth, it creates added value. Islamic finance, by its nature also, returns and keep financial and human resources in the productive sector instead of pulling them away to the virtual sector. So by all these, Islamic finance is by definition developmental, but the question that is, in my opinion, asked and answered wrongly by many writings that we find in the market, is Islamic finance required to favor businesses that produce new goods and services over consumers that only give signal market to producers? No. In my opinion, Islamic finance is not required and is not in charge of preferring producers or businesses in its financial activities over consumers. That decision is a social decision that is taken by the appropriate authorities, not by the finance provider. It is wrong, rather, to charge finance provider with the duty or function of increasing the quantity of goods and services in the economy. By definition, it creates value. That is an increase in goods and services. But to prefer certain kind of projects or certain kinds of destination of finance over other kinds, that is not at all the job of a banker. And putting it to the banker, we are creating a small god out of the banker that is not really its job, and that in fact infringes on the decision makers in the economy. I decide what car I like, not the banker. not the Islamic banker, and I decide what project I want to make, not the banker and not the Islamic banker, definitely. Now, by definition, people like to increase their wealth. So people like to be more rich. That's by definition, that's part of the instinct of everybody, but that decision cannot be given from individuals and then for the macroeconomy from the government, given to the hands of the banker, be it Islamic banker or otherwise. Definitely.
Dr. Munzir?
Yes.
Now it is already 12:15. Normally we have 1 hour from 11 to 12. How long do you need?
I have only 2 more minutes.
Okay, very good.
Only
Thank you.
2 more minutes. So the issue of development, then we are not going to put at all the Islamic banker, especially when we talk about commercial banking, not in charge of the decision of giving preference to financing businesses over consumers. No, that's not its job. Its job is to respond to any finance need on the basis of profitability and security of payment back. So that is pure and no more than that. The ethical issue, I'll wrap up it in 2 words, although it has 2 slides here, I think, but we'll make it in a few words only. We lost our friends from France again. Let's see here. Okay, are you back with us?
Yes, we got kicked off again.
Okay. Well, let's hope that you'll be back with us for this last minute. The issue of ethics, we need to realize an important point, that in Islamic innovation in finance, whenever we talk that you earn by ownership, you do not earn by transfer of wealth only. You earn by creating added value, added wealth. These are moral issues that are fundamental and must not be overlooked. I mean, take an example, for instance. We have in the market ethical funds. Ethical funds prefer financing institutions that are more green, for instance, than other institutions. But they do finance and they do invest in conventional banks' shares. They do invest in interest. They do finance also on interest. And yet they call themselves ethical. And that is a big violation of the ethical principles. Interest itself is getting an increment where there is no increment created. For God's sake, when you change the ownership of a debt from one person to another, you did not increase the economy, anything in the economy. You did not create value. You did not create wheat and sugar. So you did not do anything in the economy. You just changed the debt from X to Y. Why? You should claim an increment in it. And that increment is not true. We need to really give the appropriate weight to what we call ethical values. There are basic, fundamental ethical values that relate to human nature, that relate to the fundamental concept of justice. These, when you don't stick to these by financing on interest, for instance, and call yourself ethical, that you are financing more green than less green, well, that is distortion of the ethical proportions. Now, in Islamic finance, we stick first to the fundamental ethical values by giving earning only to owning, by giving earning only to value producing. Whenever that doesn't exist, there is no earning. And that is a fundamental moral issue that we stick to. The same way we have these, overwhelming statements that it is always better, whenever that is possible, to give more benefit to human beings, to creatures, to environment, to anything that is beneficial. Give it always more preference than other ventures, definitely. And this is a general rule in Islamic finance, and also emphasized in Islam as general, as the Prophet in the correct saying said that all creatures, not only human beings, but all creatures are dependent on God. The closest, the most beloved by God is the one who is most beneficial